Alright, so today we're going to cover the most frequently asked question of the week, and that is, my ball python won't eat, how do I get it to eat? And that's probably the #1 biggest frustrations as far as ball python owners. And let me tell you, it is a pretty common frustration as far as keeping and breeding ball pythons, especially if you're breeding them. A lot of times, you think, I want to breed my ball python this year, and it won't eat and won't eat. And of course, right at the beginning of the breeding season, then you come up to where you want to pair them up. And personally, if they don't have the body condition, I don't pair them up, because they typically they won't lay anyways if they don't have the body mass. A lot of times you can pair them up and you'll actually see copulation, but they won't actually lay any eggs because they just don't have the body reserves to actually build any eggs and to lay them. As a matter of fact, this is my bamboo ball python, a really beautiful snake. And this guy's been fasting for a couple months now. He has not eaten anything. And when it comes to ball pythons not eating, I am not worried one bit. Especially this guy, if you look at his body condition, and it's a male too. So, if it was a female, I'd probably be trying a little bit harder to put some food into this snake. But since it's a male, it doesn't really matter. As a matter of fact, he's got enough body condition. Just look at how fat that guy is. he's not really overweight, but he's got a really nice, beautiful body condition. He's nice and healthy. He could probably go at least I'd say another 2, maybe 3 months without eating, and I wouldn't worry at all. As a matter of fact, a ball python, an adult, probably this size, could go for up to 2 years without eating. But keeping that in mind, you really don't want a snake to go, to the maximum end to where they're not going to eat. You really want to try to feed them as much as possible. And usually, most people on a regular schedule, they'll feed a snake once a week on a regular basis. And usually what they'll do is they'll just attempt to feed it. And usually what I do is I use euthanized rodents. I raise my own rodents, so I use CO2 to euthanize, and I try to feed for maybe 30 seconds at a time. So I'll hold the rat in front of the snake, and if they don't eat within 30 seconds, that's fine. They missed out, they're waiting until next week. I have so many snakes, and it doesn't really matter to me. And especially my males. But if you think about the females, you really want some of the females to eat. And I actually sold a snake, let's see, probably, I think it's been about 3 months ago, and the person wrote in one of my comments that says, hey, I bought your snake, and it still hasn't eaten in like 2 or 3 months. And that is when you kind of want to think, especially if you have like a smaller, mid-sized snake, it could be a sign that something either is wrong with the husbandry, or maybe you're just not offering the correct food. So what I like to do, especially on a fasting ball python, there's one thing that is like candy to ball pythons. You really don't want to use this trick all the time. It's pretty much only when they're fasting is when I use it, and this is what I use right here. I actually have a whole bag of frozen adult mice, and you can get these online. I actually got these at Rodent Pro, and you can get them, you have to pay for the shipping, which is pretty expensive, but if you get a really large order of rodents, I usually get several $100s at a time, put them in my freezer, and they last a long time. And really what you really want is, if you're ordering rats, you definitely want to order at least a handful of these adult mice, the biggest mice you can get, because let me tell you, ball pythons, they will eat mice before anything. As a matter of fact, when they're small, when they're hatchlings, the only thing they will eat are live mouse hoppers. And for some reason, ball pythons, they can actually get addicted to mice where they won't eat anything else. As a matter of fact, I have one snake that I'm trying to get off of mice. The only thing she'll eat is these large frozen mice. And the problem is, ball pythons won't eat, multiple meals back to back to back. Usually they'll eat 1 or 2 and they're done. And a big snake like this, let me tell you, an adult mouse is not a big enough meal to sustain them for very long. So if they're eating one mouse, you can only get them to eat once every few weeks. It's really not enough for the snake. Really, you need to get them on rats and keep them on rats as much as possible. And pretty much the rule of thumb is you want a rodent that is is as big as the thickness of the biggest part of the snake. So on this one, you could use a rat that's pretty much that big. I've used them a little bit bigger. If you get too big, usually what happens if you put a really big rat in there, maybe even as big as the thickest part, maybe even a little bigger, what'll actually happen is the snake will kind of size it up and it'll decide not to eat. And I've actually seen this before, offering the wrong size rodent, and they'll just outright refuse it because it's not the right size. And the funny thing is if you offer one that's too big and then you try to follow up and say, all right, that one was too big, I'm going to try to, give them one that's a little bit smaller. Sometimes they'll get it in their mind that, all right, that rodent was too big, so I'm not going to eat the smaller one. I've seen that quite a bit. And there's a lot of different tricks to try to get ball pythons on food. I say switching over to mice is a good one, but the thing you really want to be careful of is that they don't get on mice all the time. They don't become full-time mousers. And a lot of times what you can do, I've actually done this before, is if I'm feeding mice and I want to switch over to rats, what I'll do is I'll actually euthanize some of my rats and mice at the same time, so you get the mouse smell in with your rats. Or what you can do is you can take a rat and kind of wipe it on some of your mice, get that mouse smell on the rats, and sometimes that'll work. Sometimes they'll eat it and regurgitate it. I've seen that too. They're like, wait a minute, this isn't a mouse, this tastes completely different, and it's a rat. So speaking of regurgitation, I would say one of the biggest things is, as far as regurgitation, throwing up their meals, is if you feed a rodent, you definitely don't want to handle a snake at least 2 days, preferably 3 after they have eaten, because the only time I've really seen my snakes regurgitate is if I'm really pushing them, really handling them a few days, earlier than a few days. And a lot of times what I'll do, especially in the breeding season last year, what I did is I went through and I fed all my snakes, and then the very next day I paired them up with my males. And let me tell you, even pairing them up with males, if you don't wait 2 or 3 days, they can still regurgitate. I had several females regurgitate multiple times in a row, and let me tell you, that is extremely hard on a snake, and it's really not good for them long term. And if you're having problems with regurgitation, I would say you feed your snake and wait a few days before you do anything, before you handle them, before you clean the enclosure, before you pair them up, and hopefully that will cure the regurgitation. And the other thing is if they're still throwing up their meals, I would probably go to a smaller rodent size a lot of times if it's too big. Or I've actually had this happen before, where I take a hatchling and I have a hatchling like my bamboo calico. It'll eat anything back to back to back. It's just in a crazed feeding mode. And I was kind of taking all my leftover rodents and feeding it to that snake. And one time I fed him 3 in a row, and it was too much, and he regurgitated. And they're like, all right, that is way too many rodents for a snake. You really need to back off. So I would feed smaller meals less often if they're regurgitating, and make sure you're not handling or pairing them up. So the other thing, I've actually seen some people, as far as getting picky eaters back on feed again, there's one trick that I've seen. I actually haven't tried this, but what they do is I actually take the snake and they hold it kind of by the tail, and then they'll offer the food down here while you're holding it by the tail. And I've actually seen, it's pretty amazing. Some people say, hey, this snake won't eat. They pick it up by the tail and hold a rat by the head, and sure enough, it'll take a rat. It's pretty amazing. I haven't actually tried it. And kind of the new trick that I've tried this week, just kind of out of the blue, is I had some snakes that were really picky eaters that wouldn't eat. So what I did is I put a small live rat in with them. And a lot of times they'll take live rats before they'll take like a frozen thawed or a fresh kill. For some reason, ball pythons, really like eating live. They're hunters, I think, and it really triggers their instinct. But the problem is you have a lot of people that are, against seeing a rodent suffer. It's probably the biggest thing. You don't really want to see that rat get eaten. And then the number two, probably the biggest thing, is the rat can actually hurt the snake, especially if the snake, you know, grabs the rat and wraps, and it's not a really good position to where, you know, the rodent is kind of constricted, but it can still, you know, bite the snake. I've seen actually snakes, you know, lose eyes and get really bad scars and stuff from feeding rats. So when I do, you know, if I'm feeding live rats kind of as a last resort, I'll use a rat that is significantly smaller than a snake. So for example, you know, I'd say, you know, if you're feeding a rat, the maximum is the thickness of the snake. I definitely wouldn't feed this snake a live rat that's that thick. I'd probably go half that thickness, a little, just, you know, a smaller one that they can overpower, that's not really a danger that much to the snake. And this week when I tried, I had 3 snakes that were off of food, and I actually fed the live rat. And then what I did is I followed up with a fresh kill, but instead of just dangling it, I actually tried to, you know, I tried the live rat and they took it, and I went back and I tried to offer, you know, the fresh kill rodent, the size that they should be eating right after the live, and they refused it. So then what I did is I put the fresh killed right in the tub, and I closed it up, kind of just laying there, and I would say, you know, 99% of the time, if I just take a frozen thawed rat, and I throw it in the tub and close it, my ball pythons won't eat it. And really what it takes is they need to actually grab it and wrap it before I know 100% sure that they're gonna take it. I was actually surprised. I went through and I fed a few live rodents to a few of my snakes, and then I followed up with a fresh kill, just laying it in the tub, and sure enough, 3 out of 3 actually took those, which was surprising. So that's another trick. You know, if you're feeding live, it might even work with mice. So a lot of these ball pythons, you know, they like mice. You know, a live mouse is like candy to a ball python. Maybe you feed a live mouse and then follow up with a frozen thawed or a fresh kill, just laid in the tub, just put it in there and leave them alone for maybe 10 or 15 minutes and come back and see if they've actually taken that. But let me tell you, feeding ball pythons is one of the most challenging things. I go through my collection and I say, well, this time of the year that I'm breeding, I have all my females that are gravid, full of eggs. None of those snakes will eat. I don't even offer food to those females if they're building eggs, especially if I do an ultrasound and I see eggs in there growing. I don't even offer. And then as soon as they lay, that's another thing. When they lay eggs, it's kind of another challenge to get ball pythons to eat, because they're kind of still, the females are kind of still in this, you know, protect my eggs kind of mode, and they're still coiling up, and they're thinking about breeding instead of feeding. And really, to snap them out of that, what you really need to do is strip down the whole enclosure and put in new substrate. A lot of people actually soak their snakes in water to kind of snap them out of it. As a matter of fact, if I just take one snake that's laid eggs and move it to a completely different enclosure, even if it's dirty, they'll smell another snake and get a new environment, and a lot of times they'll go back on food right away. Versus if they lay eggs and you pull the eggs and you keep them in there, then what they do is they kind of coil up and they think there's eggs there, but there's not, and they kind of stay in that mode, and sometimes they won't eat for months and months, which could really put them off for the next year. Because really what you want to do is you want to put enough rodents into them so they'll be ready for the next year. And kind of last year, I gave half my snakes off, my females, because some of them laid pretty late and they didn't have the body condition. And really, I would say as a breeder, if you're thinking about breeding maybe 10 females a year, maybe you want to get 20 females and kind of rotate them through a schedule where you can, you know, breed half of them one year and then give them the year off the next year and then breed the other half. I think it's a lot better for the snake, and it allows them to kind of recover between the breeding seasons. So that's pretty much it as far as feeding, picky feeders. You know, I have so many people that say, hey, my snake won't eat. And I would say, you know, if your environment is correct for your snake, then you can try these other things. But I would say, you know, the first I'd focus on the enclosure and the environment. What you really don't want to do is have a ball python in like a glass aquarium where there's no solid sides and no hide, nowhere to completely get away from, you know, from people and from the environment. What you really want is you want a completely dark enclosed hide, or you want like gray tubs like I have back here. And let me tell you, when I put my snakes in these tubs, they go crazy. They feed like crazy. And then if you're still having a picky feeder, that you can try is you can try some live rats kind of as a last resort, or you could try the frozen thawed mice. I'd probably do the frozen thawed mouse first, because I can almost guarantee almost any ball python that's fasting will take a frozen thawed mouse. It's pretty incredible how you switch to mice. But the only thing you really want to watch out for is you don't want to feed them too many mice all in a row. You just kind of want to feed them one or two and then go back to rats if you can, because if you have too many mice in a row, they can refuse to eat any rat. They just love the mice so much that they just decide, hey, I'm a mouser and I'm not going to eat a rat ever again. I've actually had ball pythons that kind of get in that situation, and that's one thing you have to avoid. So that's it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.